5. Money and measures. A greatly misunderstood law is Leviticus chapter 19, verses 35 to 37, concerning honesty in measurements. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgments, in meat yard, in weights, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord. The word judgment here refers to all that follows. Meat yard was a measure of length or surface, that is, yards, cubits, foot, and the like. Weights had reference to the talents, shekel, and other weights of money. Measure refers to measures of capacity, the homer, ephah, hin, etc. Balances means scales and weights. Ephah and hin cites again the forms of measurement already listed. That weights mean money has long been known. Fairbairn's Imperial Standard Bible Encyclopedia, like others, discusses the shekel under the classification of weights. The Bible speaks of money as a weight. For example, we are told that David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold by weight. 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 25. Opinions differ as to the exact nature of the talent, mina, shekel, beka, zuzah, reba, and gera, but Bonner's table of weights is perhaps as good as any. The shekel was probably half an ounce, avoir du poids weight. Bonner has been referred to deliberately because he is also the author of a commentary on Leviticus. In commenting on Leviticus chapter 19, verses 35 to 37, he devotes 3 pages to basically evangelistic homily. In 2 sentences, he refers to the specific point of the text to say, in markets, in trade, in their shops, in meting out land with the yard and cubits, or weighing articles in the balance, or trying the capacity of solids, the balances and its weights, the ephah and its subdivision, the hin, must be strictly exact. It is possible to speak of the studied irrelevance of much preaching and comment on Scripture. A law of central importance to the monetary and economic morality of a nation is treated casually or not at all. The biblical materialism of the Jews prevented them from being so irrelevant. The Talmud thus noted. Rabbah said, why did the divine law mention the exodus from Egypt in connection with interest, fringes, and weights? The Holy One, blessed be He, declared, it is I who distinguished in Egypt between the firstborn and one who is not a firstborn. Even so, it is I who will exact vengeance from him who ascribes his money to a Gentile and lends it to an Israelite on interest, or who steeps his weights in salt, or who attaches to his garment threads dyed with vegetable blue and maintains that it is real blue. The point here is that the firstborn or elect of God are those who abide by his law. Those who have outwardly enjoyed the privileges of the covenants and a covenant culture, but who deny its laws, are the subject of especial vengeance from the covenant God. C.D. Ginsburg also referred to this aspect of the law and cited its enforcement during the time of the Second Temple. It will be seen that the lawgiver uses here exactly the same phrase with regard to meting out right measure which he used in connection with the administration of justice in verse 15. He, therefore, who declares that a false measure is a legal measure is, according to this law, as much a corrupt judge and defrauds the people by false judgment as he who in the court of justice wilfully passes a wrong sentence. Owing to the fact that men who would otherwise disdain the idea of imposition often discard their scruples in the matter of weights and measures, the Bible frequently brands these dealings as wicked and an abomination to the Lord, whilst it designates the right measure as coming from God himself. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 13 and 15, Ezekiel chapter 45 verses 10 and 12, Hosea chapter 12 verse 7, Amos chapter 8 verse 5, Micah chapter 6 verses 10 and 11, Proverbs chapter 11 verse 1, chapter 16 verse 11, chapter 20 verses 10 and 23. According to the authorities during the Second Temple, he who gives false weight or measure, like the corrupt judge, is guilty of the following 5 things. He 1. Defiles the land. 2. Profanes the name of God. 3. Causes the Shekinah to depart. 4. Makes Israel perish by the sword. And 5. To go into captivity. Hence, they declared that the sin of illegal weights and measures is greater than that of incest, and is equivalent to the sin of denying that God redeemed Israel out of Egypt. They appointed public overseers to inspect the weights and measures all over the country. They prohibited weights to be made of iron, lead, or other metal liable to become lighter by wear or rust, and ordered them to be made of polished rock, of glass, etc., and enacted the severest punishment for fraud. This law has, therefore, a number of very important implications. First, the old Latin and modern laissez-faire principle, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is not biblical. Dishonest merchandising is as serious a matter as dishonest judges and courts. At this point, the modern liberals have been closer to biblical requirements than conservatives have been. The supposed evolutionary law of the jungle is not biblical morality. On the other hand, the liberal principle, let the seller beware, is not biblical either. The law cannot encourage irresponsibility on the part of either buyer or seller. Laissez-faire countenanced irresponsibility by the seller. Liberalism and socialism encourage irresponsibility by the buyer. Honest goods are necessary, but also honest payments. The states, as the Ministry of Justice, does have a duty to maintain justice in the marketplace, but it cannot confuse justice with charity. True, the states, as the policeman, can be corrupt. In fact, if the society as a whole is corrupt, the state will also be corrupt. In a healthy and godly society, the states will function successfully to restrain the minority of evildoers. The key to the situation is not the states, but the religious health of the society. The law specifically states that false weights and measures are unrighteousness in judgment, or injustices in matters calling for justice. Since justice is the ministry of the state, these are matters for the state to adjudge. Second, metre yards are measures of length or surface, of yards, feet, inches, cubits, metres and the like, including acres, as we have noted. Justice requires the maintaining of strict standards in these matters, and the penalising of those who defraud by means of false measures. Frauds in this area involve frauds in land transactions, in goods and materials, and in a variety of ways basic to commerce. Third, fraud in weights is essentially fraudulent money. Very obviously, biblical money was by weight, a weight of silver or of gold, and every form of coinage in later times was by weight. Earlier money was not by minting or coining, but was a piece of silver or gold of specific weight. The gold coinage of the United States followed the biblical pattern by establishing itself with reference to weight, the ounce, 0.900 fineness, or fractions of an ounce. Fractional reserve banking, unbacked or partially backed paper money, and inflation of money by debt and credit is thus a violation of this law. Isaiah, enlisting the charges in God's bill of indictment against Jerusalem, declared that, "Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 22. The reference is to false weights, silver replaced with baser metals or heavily alloyed with them, and to false measures, a quart of wine made into a gallon by mixture with water. Thus, the law clearly requires the condemnation of all fraudulent money. The law of the guilty bystander thus clearly condemns all ministers, priests, and teachers who do not declare the sentence of the law against fraudulent money. Their silence means a guilt comparable to that of corrupt judges or of counterfeiters, in that they counterfeit God's word by their silence or by false interpretations. As surely as a false yardstick or a false cup measure defrauds a man, just as surely a false money defrauds a man. Even worse, dishonest money introduces a false weight into every monetary transaction in a society, so that radical corruption and injustice prevail. If in every business transaction in any society a basic fraud prevails in the form of dishonest and counterfeit money, then the entire society is polluted, honest men are robbed, and thieves prevail. This is precisely what monetary fraud and inflation perpetuate, the triumph of thieves over godly men. Silence in the face of such radical corruption is an inexcusable ignorance and an evil. Ginsburg, above, cited the texts condemning false weights. They are declared to be an abomination to the Lord, as witness Solomon's declaration. Diverse weights and diverse measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 10. Diverse weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 23. In Ezekiel chapter 45, verses 9 to 12, God specified the exact ratio of the shekel to its lesser and greater weights, as well as dealing with balances and measures of capacity. The lack of justice here, God, through Ezekiel, termed violence and spoil, as well as exactions. Fourth, measures here in this law refers to measures of capacity, and the law required strict honesty here as elsewhere. Liquid and dry measures alike are covered by this law. We have noted Isaiah's condemnation of watered wine. A gallon of wine which has been watered may provide an accurate gallon, but it is still dishonest because its contents have been mixed with water. Fruits watered shortly prior to marketing gives a dishonest weight and lesser flavour. Cows given salted feed in order to make them drink heavily and increase their weight represent fraud, as do forms of trucking cows to the sales yard, which will dehydrate them and reduce their weight. Fraud thus extends beyond the scales or the bushel basket. Fifth, just balances refers to what is today called weights. Honest scales are basic to just commerce, and the regulation of scales is thus basic to the ministry of justice. The poor in particular are victimized by dishonest balances. Amos chapter 8, verses 4 to 8. They are least able to protect themselves and suffer the most from the consequences. Sixth, the consequences of violations of this law are apparent in the land itself, which will cast out the people. Even as the Nile floods Egypt, so judgment shall sweep over the people. Amos chapter 8, verse 8. The law is emphatic on the relationship of this law to life. Thou shalt not have in thy bag divers weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thine house divers measures, a great and a small. But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 13 to 15. The statement has been well noted by Luther, who observed that a just weight and just measure should be preserved in the community so that a poor person and one's neighbour are not cheated. This also has general validity for all exchanges of all contracts, that the seller give just and equable wares for the money of the buyer. Here greed knows unbelievable injustices and tricks in changing, cheapening, imitating and adulterating merchandise. Therefore, it is no small part of the concern of government to have an eye here to the common good. Luther is clearly right. The commandment, thou shalt not steal, plainly forbids changing, cheapening, imitating and adulterating merchandise, and such fraud or theft is no small part of the concern of the government. But the culminating point is too often neglected, the promise of life for obedience to this law, as well as the 5th commandment. Conversely, life is denied to those who violate this law. A land given to theft faces judgment and death. In other words, God shortens the life of the nation that condones shortchanging and defrauding by fraudulent money, scales, and other measures. Calvin said of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 35, Now, if the laws of buying and selling are corrupted, human society is in a manner dissolved, so that he who cheats by false weights and measures differs little from him who utters false coin, and consequently one who, whether as a buyer or seller, has falsified the standard measure of wine, or corn, or anything else, is accounted criminal. The Reformers, like the earlier Church Fathers, were not silent with respect to this law. In evaluating this law, it is important to set it in the context of the legal tradition of the modern era in order to understand the basic conflict of principles. The legal tradition can be divided into 3 basic positions. First, a principle of the older liberalism and more recent conservatism joins the concept of laissez-faire and self-interest. Non-interference by the state in economic affairs is required, and it is held that the self-interest of all individuals adds up to the public good. Caveat emptor reigns, and no attempt is made to enforce this Levitical law. This position clearly posits the rule of the individual as well as his ultimacy in the social order. The self-interest of the individual leads to the greatest good of the greatest number of people. Second, the new liberalism, as well as socialism, affirms the rule of the state. The self-interest of the state leads to the greatest good, because the state has the welfare of all the people at heart. Legislation is therefore necessary to enforce honest weights and measures. In the first, there is no protection for men in society from the sin and rapacity of men. In the second social order, there is no defence for men against the power and depravity of the state. Third, biblical law declares the rule of God and His law. God's self-interest is alone the true foundation of law and order. God, as all-holy, righteous, and just, does most wisely decree and govern all things. Only as men are redeemed and submit, by grace and or by compulsion, to God's law order, can there be justice. If God's law is not respected, then neither men's self-interest nor the state's self-interest can preserve the social order. Except the Lord build the house, they labour in vain that build it. Psalm 127, verse 1.